Walk into any room full of adults and you'll hear it everywhere. The dreams, the plans, the lives they're going to build, the business they're going to start, the book they're going to write, the body they're going to have, the relationship they're finally going to find. The talking never stops. The conviction sounds completely real. The wanting is genuine every single time you hear it. And here's the truth nobody wants to say out loud at that dinner table. Most of those people will never build any of it. Not because the dreams were bad, not because they didn't actually want it. They won't build the life they keep describing because somewhere along the way they quietly confuse the talking with the building. And that confusion has been running for so long now that they genuinely can't tell the two apart anymore. There's a specific gap sitting between the version of you who describes the life you want and the version of you who actually goes and builds it. The gap isn't desire. Both versions of you want it equally. The gap isn't intelligence. Both versions of you are plenty smart enough. The gap is something quieter than that, less glamorous, rarely talked about directly, and almost nobody knows exactly where it lives, which is precisely why almost nobody ever closes it. Today, I want to push back hard on the comfortable assumption that wanting the life and talking about the life is somehow close to actually building it. It isn't. It's not even in the same room. The people who have actually built the lives you've been describing to your friends for years are doing something completely different, quietly, daily, with almost no fanfare. Something you've been substituting for years with an activity that felt like progress but produced exactly nothing. 5 distinct angles today. By the end, you'll understand exactly why most people never build the dream life they talk about, and you'll see precisely what would be required starting tomorrow morning to become one of the rare few who actually do. But before we get into the 5, you need to understand what this talking about pattern has genuinely been costing you, because most people who talk about their dreams don't experience the talking as costly at all. They experience it as motivation, as accountability, as keeping the dream alive in their own mind. To them, the talking in their head feels like a positive force pushing them forward. Here's the truth: the talking is not neutral. Every single time you describe the life you're going to build, your brain receives a small hit of reward. That reward feels remarkably like progress. Your brain quietly registers that you're the kind of person who has this dream, who is committed to it, who is somewhere on the path toward it. And that registration substitutes, neurologically, for a real slice of the satisfaction you would have gotten from actually doing the underlying work. This is genuinely well documented. The same psychological reward that would come from real measurable progress also comes from simply announcing your intention out loud. Your brain treats the two as roughly similar, and once it's already gotten some of that reward from the talking, it has noticeably less drive left over to go chase the doing. The motivation that should have powered the actual work has already been spent, quietly, on the conversation about the work instead. And the talking compounds. Every single year you spend describing the life you're eventually going to build is a year you have not built it, while simultaneously collecting the small rewards of describing it instead. The pattern reinforces itself with almost no effort. The describing becomes the substitute. The dream stays exactly a dream because the dreaming feels like enough to satisfy whatever part of you needed the satisfaction in the first place. You have to reckon with this honestly. The cost of years spent talking about your dream isn't just the time you lost, it's the dream itself slowly going stale because the actual doing never got started underneath it. By the time you're 40, the dream you've been talking about since you were 25 has either been built or it has been quietly abandoned somewhere along the way. There is no third option sitting between those two. The talking does not preserve the dream indefinitely. It simply allows the dream to fade while you keep telling yourself, sincerely, that you're still committed to it. Here's what most people in their 40s eventually realize, usually with a fair amount of quiet regret. The dreams they talked about for 15 or 20 years were almost all completely reachable if they'd spent even half the time actually building that they spent describing. The describing didn't preserve the dream at all. The describing replaced the building, and by the time they finally understood the substitution that had been happening the whole time, the years were already gone, and the dream had become nothing more than a memory of who they once said they were going to become. This isn't a small, isolated mistake a handful of unlucky people happen to make. It's closer to the default setting most adults are quietly running without ever choosing it consciously. Nobody sits down one day and decides on purpose that they'll spend the next 20 years describing a life instead of building one. It happens gradually, one comfortable conversation at a time, each one feeling completely harmless in the moment, each one providing just enough satisfaction to make tomorrow's inaction feel bearable. You don't notice the substitution happening in real time because no single conversation ever feels like the one that mattered. It's only once you add up hundreds of those conversations, spread across a decade or two, that the actual size of what was lost becomes visible at all. Five angles, all circling the same core truth: why the talking doesn't build anything, and what would actually be required to close the gap for good. By the end, you'll know exactly which side of the gap you've been living on, and you'll have a genuinely clear choice about which side you want to live on from here forward. The first angle to understand is the most basic one, and also the most overlooked. Most people who talk about their dream life genuinely want it. The desire is completely real. They aren't faking it. They aren't performing for an audience, at least not consciously. They really do want to write the book, start the business, get in shape, find the partner, change careers, build the thing. The wanting is sincere all the way through, and the wanting produces nothing, because wanting is simply not the same activity as building. They are two entirely different mental and physical processes, and they do not naturally lead into one another the way we assume they will. You can want something for decades without ever taking a single concrete step toward it. The wanting will keep showing up right on schedule. The building will not start unless you deliberately do something quite different from what the wanting naturally feels like from the inside. Here's the truth: the path from wanting to building is not automatic. It requires a specific, deliberate shift that almost nobody is ever taught. The wanting tells you to keep thinking about the thing, keep talking about it, keep imagining it in detail, keep dreaming about it at night. The building requires you to stop most of that entirely and just perform small, concrete actions in the direction of the thing every single day for years. This is exactly why so many people who clearly genuinely want something never end up building it. They take the wanting itself as evidence that they're somewhere on the path. They aren't. They're on an entirely separate road called wanting. The road called building is a completely different road, running in a different direction, and the wanting road never converges with the building road, no matter how many years you spend faithfully traveling down it. The fix is to recognize plainly that wanting and building are different activities, and to start the building even while the wanting is still insisting you're not ready yet. You are never going to feel ready. The wanting will keep telling you that you need a little more preparation, a little more research, a little more clarity, a little more motivation before you can begin. None of that is actually required. What's required is starting the small daily action that constitutes the real building, today, exactly as unready as you currently feel. You can want the thing and build the thing at the same time. They aren't mutually exclusive. The wanting will probably keep showing up. You don't have to suppress it or pretend it's gone. But you stop treating the wanting itself as evidence of progress. The wanting is just a feeling passing through you. The building is the actual work, and the work has to start even while the wanting is insisting you're not ready to start yet, because waiting for the wanting to feel fully resolved first is waiting for something that simply never arrives on its own. You have to accept that wanting isn't building, and that the gap between the two is entirely yours to close. Nobody else can close it on your behalf. You cannot delegate this particular piece of work to anyone. The wanting will not, on its own, eventually transform into building given enough time. You have to consciously redirect energy away from the wanting activities, the thinking, the talking, the elaborate dreaming, and into the building activities instead. That redirection is the actual work. The work has to get done, and you have to do it every single day, regardless of how the wanting happens to feel in any given moment. Picture two people, both stuck in careers they've quietly hated for years, both describing, in almost identical language, the completely different work they'd rather be doing instead. Both of them want it with total sincerity. Neither one is lying to themselves or to anyone else. One of them spends the next 2 years wanting it harder, reading about it more, imagining the transition in vivid detail during long commutes, feeling the familiar warm rush of possibility every time the topic comes up at dinner. The other one spends those same 2 years sending out a small number of concrete applications every single week, taking one relevant evening class, having a handful of genuinely awkward informational conversations with strangers in the field. From the outside, in any single week, the two of them look remarkably similar, both still stuck in the same job, both still talking about the same eventual future. 2 years later, one of them is still wanting it exactly as intensely as before. The other one has actually made the move. The wanting was identical the whole way through. The daily action was not, and that's the entire difference between the two of them. The second angle gets more specific. Talking about your dream produces a real neurological reward that crowds out the motivation you'd otherwise have for actually building it. This isn't a moral failing on your part, it's simply how the human brain is wired, and the people who do build the lives they want have figured out, whether intuitively or quite deliberately, that talking about the life is actually the enemy of building it. When you tell somebody about the business you're going to start, your brain releases a small dose of reward chemistry, the same chemistry that would have come from making real, tangible progress. Your brain doesn't always cleanly distinguish between the announcement of an intention and the actual realization of that intention. Both register as small accomplishments. Both produce a small dose of genuine satisfaction. Here's the truth: the dose is small, but it's remarkably persistent. Every conversation where you describe the business is another small dose. Every social setting where you casually mention the plan is another one. Across years, you've been quietly collecting substantial reward chemistry from talking about something you haven't actually built, and that reward has been doing exactly what reward always does: training your brain to keep doing whatever produced it. What produced it was the talking, so your brain keeps steering you toward more talking. The building, on the other hand, produces almost no reward at all in the short term. The first 6 months of building anything genuinely meaningful produce almost nothing visible to show for it. Your brain, comparing the immediate reward of talking against the deferred, delayed reward of building, naturally and predictably chooses talking every single time. And so you talk, and the years quietly go by, and you've talked an enormous amount, and you've built almost nothing at all. The fix is to drop the talking about the thing almost entirely until the thing is substantially built. This is genuinely one of the hardest disciplines in all of adult life because the talking is exactly what feels like motivation. The talking is exactly what feels like commitment. Cutting the talking feels from the inside like cutting the dream itself. It isn't. You're cutting the substitute. You're not letting go of the dream. The dream stays completely intact. The substitute has simply been quietly preventing it from ever becoming real. You have to keep the dream mostly private, one trusted person at most, maybe, not your wider social circle, not the people you're trying to impress, not the regular conversation at parties and family dinners. The dream lives quietly in the background of your life, while the daily building happens with no fanfare and no announcements to anyone. After years of building, once the thing actually exists in the world, you can start talking about it freely. By then, the talking can't undo the doing, because the doing has already produced something real that speaks for itself. This is a genuinely brutal practice for most people because the talking has been one of their primary daily pleasures for years. Cutting it requires accepting that the pleasure itself was quietly costing them the very thing they were talking about. The cost was hidden the entire time. The cost was completely real, and paying it down, by going quiet about the dream and starting the daily work instead, is exactly what produces the rare few people who actually build what most people only ever describe. You've probably watched this exact mechanism play out with something as ordinary as a fitness goal. Somebody announces at the start of the year that this is finally the year they get in shape. They tell their partner, their coworkers, half their social feed. Each announcement lands with a genuine little rush. People respond with encouragement. The person feels seen and supported and, for a moment, already partly transformed. That rush is real, and it's also nearly the same chemical reward that would have come from an actual completed workout. Weeks later, the workouts still haven't really started, but the announcements keep coming in slightly different forms: a new plan, a new program they just read about, a new start date that feels more realistic this time. Every announcement quietly refills the tank that should have been getting filled by actual training sessions instead. The goal was never insincere. The reward economy around it was just badly designed from the very beginning, built entirely on talking instead of on reps. The third angle becomes obvious the moment you actually look closely at people who have built the lives that most people only talk about. They don't talk about their lives the same way the talkers do. The talking itself is different. The energy around the whole topic is different. And once you've noticed that difference clearly, you genuinely cannot unsee it again. The talkers describe their dreams with real intensity. They get animated. They light up. They want you to know exactly how important this is to them, how badly they want it, how deeply committed they are to making it happen. The talking is performative, partly for you, and partly for themselves. It functions to keep a certain identity alive, the identity of being the kind of person who has this particular dream. The builders, by contrast, are noticeably calmer about their own projects. They might mention what they're working on almost as a passing side note, with very little emphasis attached to it. They don't perform the wanting for anyone. They don't seem to need you to be impressed by the dream itself. They simply describe what they're currently doing briefly, and then go right back to doing it. The energy is different because the underlying relationship to the work is genuinely different. Here's the truth: The builders have a quiet, almost business-like relationship with their own work, because the work is actually happening. They don't need to talk it up for anyone. They don't need to convince themselves that it matters. The daily, tangible evidence of progress provides whatever reassurance they might otherwise need. So the talking, when it happens at all, comes out as a small, calm report on something real, not a performance of something purely imagined. The talkers, meanwhile, need the talking specifically to keep the dream feeling alive. Without the talking, the dream would have no daily evidence at all to support it. So the talking has to do all the heavy lifting of keeping the dream feeling real, even when there's no actual building happening underneath it. That's exactly why it's so animated. That's exactly why it's so intense. The intensity has to compensate for the total absence of real, underlying progress. You can actually use this observation as a diagnostic tool on your own life. Listen closely to how you talk about your own dreams. If your talking has that animated, intense, performative quality of somebody who genuinely needs the conversation to keep the dream feeling alive, that's real information about where you stand. The talking is doing work that should be getting done by the building instead. The performance is the substitute, and the substitution itself is precisely what's preventing the actual life from ever getting built underneath it. The shift, when it eventually comes, is gradual. As you start actually building, the talking naturally quiets down on its own. You don't need to force it down or suppress it. The animation fades because the work itself is now providing the daily reassurance that used to come exclusively from the conversations. You become quieter about the dream simply because you're now busy actually doing the dream. And the people around you, who used to hear you describe the future business in vivid detail, start hearing you casually mention what you're actually doing this particular week instead. The talking has changed shape entirely because your relationship to the underlying work has changed. You can watch this diagnostic play out at almost any casual gathering if you know what to listen for. One person, asked what they're working on, launches into 10 confident minutes about the vision, the market opportunity, the plan for the next 3 years, the reasons this is finally going to be the one that works. Another person, asked the exact same question, mentions in about 15 seconds that they shipped a small update last week and picked up 2 new customers, then asks you something about your own life and moves on. Neither answer tells you anything definitive about talent or even eventual success, but one of them is describing a plan, the other is reporting on work already underway. If you had to guess which one had something real sitting behind it a year later, the calm, brief answer is almost always the safer bet, and the pattern holds up remarkably well once you start paying attention to it in your own circle of friends. The fourth angle is the one that matters most of all, because it points directly at what actually closes the gap between talking and building. The gap is not closed by motivation. It is not closed by clarity. It is not closed by passion, however genuine that passion happens to be. The gap is closed by tolerance, specifically tolerance for unglamorous, repetitive, frequently boring daily work. And the people who can tolerate that kind of work for years on end are the exact people who eventually build the lives the rest of us only ever describe out loud. Every meaningful dream has an unglamorous reality sitting quietly behind it. The novel is daily pages, most of which are genuinely bad on the first pass. The business is daily emails, calls, and small unglamorous decisions, most of which feel completely unimpressive in the moment. The body is daily training sessions and daily food choices, most of which are tedious rather than thrilling. The relationship is daily showing up, listening, attending to someone else, much of which is simply repetitive. The dream is the eventual result. The daily work is the actual building, and the daily work is nowhere near as exciting as the talking tends to suggest it should be. Picture a man who had been talking about writing a novel for 15 straight years. By the time you'd meet somebody like him, he'd typically be somewhere around 38 years old. His friends all knew about the novel. He referenced it comfortably at parties. He had concepts. He had outlines. He had scattered fragments here and there. What he did not have was a finished novel. He did not have anything close to a complete draft. He didn't even have a substantial, continuous body of actual writing sitting anywhere. But he talked about the novel constantly, with real excitement, with real conviction, with a persistent sense that any day now the actual writing would finally get going in earnest. And so the years quietly passed. 15 of them, with the novel perpetually about to begin. Suppose he eventually ends up at a writer's workshop somewhere. There he meets another man roughly his own age who had just published his second novel. He corners the published writer during a coffee break and asks the obvious question everyone in his position eventually asks. How did you actually do it? The published writer thinks for a moment and then gives an answer that quietly breaks something open in our talker. He says, I wrote 500 words a day for 3 straight years on the first book. It was almost always bad. I edited it something like 80 separate times. The work itself was tedious. None of it felt anything like the novelist life I used to imagine for myself when I was younger. I just kept doing 500 words a day. After 3 years, I had a finished, edited, genuinely publishable book. The second one took 2 years. Same method. 500 words a day. No drama, no magic, just the daily work repeated. The talker goes quiet for a long time after hearing that. He'd spent 15 years imagining the novelist's life as something inherently glamorous, some blend of inspiration, craft, identity, and ritual. He'd been quietly waiting for that glamorous life to begin on its own. The published writer's actual version of events was something entirely different, a daily grind of mostly bad pages, repeated for years, with almost nothing about it that resembled the imagined life of a novelist at all. And in that exact moment, the talker finally understood what 15 years of talking had been quietly preventing him from seeing the whole time. The gap between him and the published writer was never desire, he'd wanted it just as badly as anyone ever could. The gap was never talent either, he could genuinely write. The gap was tolerance for the unglamorous daily work. He had simply been unwilling to produce 500 words of mostly bad writing every single day. He had only wanted to write when it felt inspired, only when it felt like the novelist's life he'd been imagining for so long. And so he had written almost nothing at all across 15 full years. Say he starts his own 500 words of not just 2 days after that conversation. Most days the writing is genuinely bad. Some days it's outright terrible. He keeps going anyway. 2 years later, his first novel is actually finished. The Talking, which had filled 15 entire years, finally turns out to be worth less than the doing. The doing took 2 years. The talking had taken 15. When the novel eventually gets published, he'd likely tell you that every single day of those 2 years was tedious, that every single day the writing was genuinely harder than the talking had ever been, but that every single day still produced something real. The talking across 15 years had produced nothing at all. 2 years of unglamorous daily writing had produced an actual finished book. That ratio is more or less universal across every domain you can think of. The talkers spend many years on the talking. The builders spend comparatively few years on the actual building. The gap between them is tolerance for unglamorous work, sustained daily for however many years it genuinely takes. And that tolerance, not desire, not talent, not motivation, is what ultimately separates the people who build their lives from the people who only ever describe them at dinner parties. The same pattern shows up almost identically outside of writing. Somebody who's talked for years about starting a small business usually imagines a version of entrepreneurship full of big decisions, bold pivots, exciting launches. The actual daily reality behind almost every small business that survives its first 5 years looks nothing like that. It looks like answering the same handful of customer questions over and over, sending the same kind of follow-up email, fixing the same small operational problem for the third time this month, adjusting a price by a few dollars and watching what happens. None of it photographs well. None of it makes for an exciting story at a dinner party. But it's the actual substance of building something real. And the people who can tolerate that substance for years are the ones who eventually get to stand at the front of a business that exists, while everyone's still talking about their own someday business is still exactly where they were 5 years earlier. The fifth angle is the one you can apply directly to your own life today, with total uncomfortable honesty. At any given point in your life, you are either currently building or you are currently talking. There is no real middle category, no matter how much it might feel like there is one. The preparing to build, the almost ready to build, the about to build any day now categories all collapse under any honest examination into either talking or building. And the only genuinely honest question worth asking yourself is which one you're actually doing right now, today, at this exact moment. Most people strongly prefer to live in that comfortable middle category. They feel like they're somewhere between the talking and the building, not actively building yet, but not simply talking either. Researching, planning, preparing, gathering more inputs, waiting patiently for the right moment to finally arrive. All of these feel, from the inside, like some legitimate third option that doesn't require admitting they aren't actually building anything yet. Here's the truth. That third option is mostly just talking wearing a slightly more elaborate disguise. Researching the business isn't building the business. Planning the novel isn't writing the novel. Preparing to start training isn't training. These activities genuinely feel like progress while they're happening, but they produce essentially nothing tangible. They belong entirely to the talking category, just dressed up more convincingly. The honest question is simply this. What does the actual building look like for your specific dream? And am I doing that specific thing daily? For the novel, the actual building is words landing on the page daily. For the business, the actual building is customers, sales, and products actually shipped daily. For the body, the actual building is workouts, food choices, and sleep daily. If you can clearly name the daily action that constitutes real building, and you are not currently doing that action daily, you are talking. The talking might be sophisticated, the surrounding activity might be genuinely elaborate, but if it isn't the actual building itself, it's still talking underneath all the elaborate packaging. You have to apply this test ruthlessly to your own life without flinching. Pick the one dream you've been describing the longest. Identify precisely what the actual daily building would look like for that specific dream. Then honestly ask yourself, am I doing that today? If the answer is no, you are not building, you are talking, no matter how impressive or committed that talking happens to sound from the outside. Somebody spending 3 hours a night researching competitors, reading about business models, and refining a spreadsheet of projections genuinely feels productive while they're doing it. And in a narrow sense, they are, that research isn't worthless on its own. But if the actual business still has zero customers and zero revenue a year into that nightly research habit, the honest label for what's been happening is talking with extra steps, not building. The building would have been reaching out to 10 potential customers and seeing what they actually say, whether or not the spreadsheet was finished yet. The research felt like the responsible, careful version of progress. The gap between the research and an actual paying customer is exactly where the whole dream quietly stalled out. The good news buried inside all of this is that the diagnosis points directly at its own fix. If you're currently talking, you start building today with the smallest possible version of the actual daily building action available to you. 500 words, one sales call, one workout. Whatever the genuinely irreducible daily building action happens to be for your specific dream, you do it today, and then you do it again tomorrow, and you do it again the day after that. You don't have to build perfectly from day one. You simply have to start living in the building category instead of the talking category. The moment you complete the first day's actual building action, you have moved from one side of the gap to the other side. The talking version of you has stopped being who you are. The building version has quietly begun. And once that shift is made, the years of building start producing exactly what the years of talking never could, no matter how many of them there were. So here is the inversion you genuinely need to make in your own thinking. Stop assuming that wanting the life and talking about the life is meaningfully different from simply sitting on your couch doing absolutely nothing. It isn't, functionally speaking. The wanting and the talking produce no actual results out in the real world. They produce internal reward, which feels remarkably like progress, while quietly preventing the real progress that would have come from actual building instead. The fix has three concrete parts. First, you have to go quiet about the dream, almost entirely, with one trusted person at most. Not your wider social circle, not the parties and dinners, not the casual conversations where you used to comfortably describe the future business, the planned book, the dream relationship. The dream becomes private. The daily building happens without any running commentary attached to it. Second, you have to identify the actual daily building action for your specific dream. What is the smallest, most repeatable thing that done every single day would genuinely constitute real building? 500 words for the novel, one outreach for the business, 30 minutes of training for the body, one small, concrete daily action identified with real precision that constitutes the actual building rather than mere preparation for building at some point later. Third, you have to do that action every single day, regardless of how it happens to feel in the moment. Not when you're inspired, not when conditions happen to be perfect, not only when you happen to have time, every day. The tedium is genuinely the point of the whole exercise. The unglamorous repetition is precisely what produces the eventual result. The work is mostly bad most days. The work continues anyway. The daily action, sustained across years, eventually produces what the talking never could produce in any amount of time. But here's the honest truth about the early stretch. The first 6 months of doing the actual building will produce almost nothing visible to show anyone. You will be genuinely tempted to start talking about it again, just to get a taste of the reward chemistry that the talking used to reliably give you. Resist that temptation. Keep building. Keep quiet about it. Trust that the daily action is doing real work even during the months when that work isn't visible to you or anyone else yet. Somewhere around year two, things typically start becoming visible. The novel has a substantial draft sitting in front of you. The business has its first real paying customers. The body has genuinely changed shape. The relationships have actually deepened. The visible progress finally validates everything that was quietly happening during those invisible early months. You're now able to talk about it honestly because there's finally something real underneath the words, and the talking when it finally happens sounds completely different this time. It's the calm description of work already in progress, not the animated performance of a dream that only exists in conversation. It carries the energy of a builder, not a talker, because that's genuinely what you've become by then. Somebody who builds, rather than somebody who simply talks about building. That's the whole shift in a single sentence. You have to stop substituting the talking for the building. Identify the daily action. Do it every day without exception. Go quiet about the dream until the building has produced something real and undeniable. The rest genuinely takes care of itself over however many years it actually takes, in the same way it has always taken exactly that long for everyone who's ever actually done this before you. So here is what I want you to walk away carrying with you today. Most people will never build the life they talk about. The dream you have been describing for years, the future you've been quietly pointing at in conversations with friends and family. Most people standing exactly where you're standing right now will not build it. The talking will keep going. The building will not start on its own. The years will pass regardless, and the dream will quietly fade while the talking somehow continues completely uninterrupted. You don't have to be one of those people. The fix genuinely isn't complicated. The fix is uncomfortable because it requires giving up the daily reward of talking about the thing, and it requires accepting up front that the actual building is mostly unglamorous and genuinely slow. But it is reachable, it is available, it is doable, starting today, right now, before you go back to whatever you were doing before this. The version of you who starts the daily building action today is going to be standing in a completely different place 5 years from now than the version of you who simply keeps talking. Not by a small margin, by an enormous one, because the math of daily action, sustained consistently for years, is the exact same math that has produced every single life the talkers around you only ever describe out loud. Pick one dream, just one, the one you've been talking about the longest, the one you can describe in vivid detail without even trying, the one you've been quietly pointing at for years now. Identify the actual daily building action that would genuinely move it forward, not the preparation, not the research, the actual daily building itself. 500 words, one call, 30 minutes, something specific, something completely doable today, and then do it today, not after this ends, not tomorrow, today, right now if you're able to. Every single day after this one becomes another build day. That very first day's action is the most important one of all because it moves you cleanly from the talking category into the building category, with one concrete act that the previous version of you never quite got around to actually doing. You have to do it again tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, for a year, for 2 years, for however long the dream genuinely takes to build in full. The years are going to pass either way. The only real question left is whether they pass with you talking or with you building. That choice gets made fresh every single day, based entirely on whether you do the actual daily action or not. Today is simply the first day. All the rest of the building, every year of it, follows directly from this one action you take today, before you let yourself go back to talking your way out of it one more time. The gap between the talkers and the builders is genuinely small in any single given moment, and absolutely enormous across years. One day's worth of action is basically nothing on its own. 1,000 days worth of action is everything. Start with the first day. The rest is simply the same small thing, repeated until the dream you've been describing for years finally exists out in the actual world, instead of only existing in your conversations about it. You cannot reverse the years that have already gone toward talking. Those are spent, and there's no getting them back. You can still fully claim the years that are still ahead of you. Spend them building instead. Every single day, the smallest possible action in the direction of the thing you actually want. The math handles the rest from there, the way it always has for everyone who's ever actually walked this exact road before you. One last thing before you go, because it's worth saying plainly. None of this requires you to become a different person. Someone naturally more disciplined, more driven, more special than you currently are. That's actually the comforting lie the talking version of this advice usually sells. That building requires some rare internal quality most people simply weren't handed at birth. It doesn't. It requires exactly one decision repeated on a day you don't feel like it, and then again on the next day you don't feel like it either. The people who built the lives you've been quietly admiring from a distance were not immune to not feeling like it. They simply stopped treating not feeling like it as a valid reason to skip the day. That's the entire secret, if you want to call it that. There isn't a more impressive one hiding underneath it. This is Max Solven, and I'll see you in the next one.